Mary, I want to ask you about your approach to the fatal shooting of Renee Good, as well as the fatal shooting of Alex Pretti. Have you, in your time as an attorney, ever experienced anything like what you're experiencing in attempt to investigate those two cases?
Not exactly like this, but I've had, we had the assassination of Melissa Hortman and her husband, and there were joint investigations there with the BCA and the FBI. And then kind of some, we charge homicides. If you violate state law, that is within our jurisdiction. And so in that case, the feds obviously did charge. We charged as well. We wanted to go first there because they were members of our community here, our legislature, and the feds decided that they were going to go first, and so that, they have a right to do that. I also had an experience in my first year where a federal agent, not ICE, but a federal agent and a sheriff's deputy shot and killed someone. And I learned from that about federal investigations. What I learned was that the feds came in, they did an investigation, they invited me and others in to view a PowerPoint of their top line conclusions. They didn't give us any of the investigation, and they told us that we could not talk publicly about anything that we saw in the PowerPoint. And so that was helpful to me because I realized when we've had these situations, or this came up, that it was critically important that there be an investigation by state law enforcement, and that we make a decision about whether charges were appropriate or not, and that there be complete transparency about it. And as you probably know, the BCA, when a case is done, posts its entire investigation on their website. I've always been very transparent on decisions about here's the decision that we've made and here's why. And I know this community demands that, absolutely demands it and deserves it. And so I knew that we were facing a few issues there. Right after Renee Good was killed, I contacted somebody from the U.S. Attorney's Office and the FBI and the BCA, and we all, I won't. Sometimes when I say it's an agreement, people say, well, was it a formal written agreement? Were there emails? And no, it really didn't work that way. The FBI and the BCA have a good working relationship. So it was just kind of to clarify, hey, there's going to be a joint investigation here. And that was all worked out, and then suddenly it wasn't. We were told that the BCA got kicked out, and eventually learned that directive came from the administration, and then learned that there was absolutely going to be no use of force investigation into her shooting and killing. And in fact, they were going to investigate her and her widow. And so from that time, we've been working with the BCA. As you know, we did the public portal.
The public portal was something that I did want to ask you about. I've never seen a public portal. Is this a normal strategy that you all have deployed before? If it's not, how does that compare to what a traditional investigation would be like?
Absolutely not. It's not something that we've ever done before. I don't know that it's really been heard of around the country either. And the reason we did it was this. We knew the BCA didn't have access and probably wasn't going to get access to anything the feds had, and we kept seeing videos being released, right? Leaked, evidently. And so our goal, because we knew community was there, right? And we wanted to be able to get any kind of video or evidence, was somebody there as a witness. So we opened that portal and we asked people to send us video. Were you there? Do you know if somebody's there? Do you have any ideas? So it was kind of a creative, innovative attempt to gather as much evidence as we could, given the blockade we were receiving from the federal government. And we have received substantial information and helpful information from that portal.
How is it different?
Well, the difference is when law enforcement does an investigation, well, let me give you an example. So when we get video from the portal, what we have to do is reach out, and this is why we asked that it not be anonymous, that we needed contact information and names. Somebody has to go out there and talk to that person and get the cell phone and pull the video from that cell phone. That is how it could be admissible in court. And with AI right now, we have to be able to, it's a legal term called authenticate. Like, is this video something that actually happened that we could bring to court as evidence? And so that creates some of those problems, but we have been able to reach out and have the BCA interview people and collect video. But it does create some of those problems that you don't have when law enforcement directly gathers information.
Do you have an estimate of how many pieces of evidence have been submitted?
I don't know anymore. It was a substantial number. We have a team that looks through all of that and shares
several hundred, thousand?
I would say hundreds, and I really honestly don't know at this point. But we had a team look through all of those to figure out, is this helpful or not, to share it with the BCA. We also know that there were witnesses in that case and also in the Alex Pretti shooting that were frightened and didn't know who to talk to, so we've done our best to connect them in safe ways. So it actually has been very helpful. Unusual, but you have to kind of be innovative, I think, in ways when you're getting resistance like this from the federal government.
And why not just let them investigate it? What made you,
right,
in light of these conditions, say, no, we're going to be creative, we're going to find a different way to move forward with our own investigation?
A couple of things. The statements that were coming from the administration, it's really not appropriate to draw conclusions about what happened in a situation within the hour, and characterizing Renee Good as a domestic terrorist, all the kind of stuff we've heard. It's just not appropriate. And when you see that happening, you question, well, if you already seem to have made up your mind about what happened. And the other thing was the experience that I told you about, knowing that it's important to me, it's important to this community, to be able to have access to the information, to be able to talk about it publicly. Because people have no reason to trust anything that government does unless there's transparency. And they may agree, disagree, but they deserve to have transparency. And the only way we were going to be able to do that is if we did this investigation in conjunction with the BCA, so that everything that we collected and whatever decision we make, we could be transparent about. And I'm a lifelong Minnesotan. I've lived in Minneapolis for a very long time. And I owe that, we owe that to our community. Transparency, explaining what we learned and why we make whatever decision that we make. And I knew that that was not going to happen if we didn't do it. And then certainly after the fact, learning that they never intended or they stopped any kind of actual investigation into Renee Good's shooting confirmed that that was the right decision.
Was there anything you learned in the aftermath of the fatal shooting of Renee Good that informed decisions you made after Alex Pretti was fatally shot? Absolutely.
We had another shooting in there that fortunately wasn't fatal. On January 14th, a man was shot in the leg. And once again, the BCA was blocked from that scene. So we also had that. So when I heard, actually from social media, that a person had been shot, I didn't even know that Alex Pretti had been killed at that point. I contacted the BCA and I said, are you aware of this? Are you going down there? The answer was yes. We sent one of our prosecutors there to the scene along with the BCA, and so I was hearing reports from the ground there. And contrary to what the administration is claiming, they're claiming that it was the community that blocked the BCA from processing the scene, and that was not true. The federal agents were physically blocking the BCA from entering that scene to do what they normally do, to collect evidence and process the scene. And they were doing that by standing, and people were down there live streaming, and I was watching that too, standing a couple of feet apart with what looked like large batons. And so we were prepared for, weren't prepared for somebody else to be shot and killed, but certainly learned from the previous incidents that this was likely to happen, and really to think through, okay, if this happens, what can we do? So then we worked with the BCA. They drafted a search warrant. We made sure that a judge was available on Saturday to sign it. So they had a judicially signed warrant. And the idea there was they were going to serve the warrant on DHS and hopefully be allowed to enter the scene. They were not. I don't even think the BCA was given the name of anybody to serve the warrant on. So once again, there was a blockade. The federal government would not accept a judicially signed warrant on behalf of the BCA.
Should the public be concerned about that type of dismissal of the law?
Absolutely, absolutely. And before or whatever we're calling this, I refer to as occupation attack on Minnesotans from the federal government, that would not be a problem. The BCA would show up, there would be coordination there, we would work it out, and so yes, they should be concerned that the federal government is physically blocking our own state agency from properly investigating the scene. And so when they blocked refused to honor the search warrant, the search warrant, we then worked with the BCA, that's represented by the Attorney General's office, to file a lawsuit in federal court later that day. We also asked for a TRO, a temporary restraining order. And it was very unusual because our ask was simply to order the federal government to preserve and not alter any of the evidence, which one would hope would be, would happen, right? But based on everything that we had seen and learned and heard, we thought it was appropriate to try to preserve whatever evidence might have been picked up at the scene. The judge granted that. So in other words, did enter that order.
Kind of just reinforcing laws that already exist.
Yes, although it was a little unusual because typically I think federal courts and courts in general are a little resistant to order agencies to do what's already required by law.
Yeah.
Because it appears to be kind of questioning whether they're acting legally.
Right.
So yes, it was telling them, follow the law essentially, but the judge did that. He then scheduled a hearing this past Monday at 2 o'clock to argue and allow DHS to argue as to why it wasn't appropriate. I think all the issues were aired there, and we're just waiting for a decision from the court as to whether his order will be permanent.
And is there any indicator on the timeline of his decision?
No. So, for instance, he didn't say, I will issue an order by such and such a date. But in situations like this, we would expect an order to be coming any day now.
Absolutely. You recently stated publicly that based on the evidence you received, you feel confident you'll be able to make a decision. You didn't indicate what type of decision. But do you have a sense of the timeline? I know what we've been hearing from community, there's concern that your term ends, and to think about the unknown of whoever comes in next picking this up without a decision being made. Do you have any sense of a timeline of when your office might be making a decision in these cases?
I feel confident that we will have enough information to make a decision, charge or not charge. I do not know what that decision will be. I would never give a timeline on it because I don't want to, if we weren't ready at a particular time, then I let people believe we're going to make a decision. It certainly will be before the end of my term that we will make a decision. But you do raise an issue of whoever comes after me. I would imagine that this won't be finished by then, and so voters need to be very aware of voting for somebody that will continue on, in my mind, in the path, in the direction we're going.
Absolutely. You raise a point that in a lot of ways this investigation is not just simply about the facts, it's deeply political. Yes,
not our investigation, but I think, and I hear from community all the time, and I know people are frustrated, like, we've seen the video. Why haven't you made a decision? So there are many videos, and we've tried to sync them. There are witnesses being interviewed. We do not even have the autopsy report yet from the medical examiner. Not unusual. They're very thorough. It takes a very long time.
In both cases?
Correct. So there are just things that we need factually. We're trying to get interviews with people that were at the scene. That takes some time, especially when you're working with people who are frightened, who have lawyers. We go through that, and that's all normal. But there are some legal issues that we have to be prepared for as well, should we decide to go forward. In state court, when you're talking about a peace officer and deadly use of force, we have to be able to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that there was an intentional killing or whatever the charge is. We also have to disprove a potential defense offered by law enforcement that what they did was reasonably, objective for a law enforcement officer. It's even more complicated when you're talking about charging a federal officer. I've heard this administration say many times there's absolute immunity. This is not true, and I think they've backed off of that. So I think, first of all, it's important for community to understand that is not true. There is no such thing as absolute immunity for someone who violates state law. It doesn't matter who you work for. Where that does come into play is this. Some people have asked me, well, why don't you subpoena records? Why don't you do this? Things that we would normally do in a state court investigation get more complicated when you're asking, for instance, for records or evidence from the federal government. There's a whole process, and I won't bore everybody and go into the weeds on that, but the Supreme Court has said you can't just subpoena that information. You have to request it, and you have to make a case for why they should give it to you. So that's more complicated. And in federal court, so if we were to charge, we expect that the case there would be an attempt to remove it to federal court. The interesting thing about that is that even though, if it got removed to federal court, it would still be us prosecuting it. It would not be the U.S. Attorney's Office. It would still be us. And state law still applies, which is important. State law, sentencing, all of that still applies. It's just that we would be trying the case in federal court. The differences probably are, major differences are you're drawing a jury from Minnesota, not just Hennepin County. But so we would expect that motion to remove. We also have to would have to respond to a motion to dismiss, that the officer does have some kind of immunity. So it's much more complicated than people think. And I totally understand that people want answers based on what they've seen. And what I guarantee them is we are being very methodical and careful in our process here, anticipating, collecting information so that we can make the analysis. And if we decide to go forward, that we're doing it in a way that we're prepared for what we'll likely see. And I won't ask people to be patient. I've said that before. I understand what this community's been through. And at the same time, I will be as transparent as I can about what we're doing. The one thing I won't do is promise timing, except for that decision will be made before my term is over.
Does the Hennepin County Attorney's Office have the ability, and if it does, would it consider an independent autopsy?
So the autopsy is being done by the Hennepin County Medical Examiner. And I believe there won't be a need for that. I do believe that so I understand the family, the Good family got an independent autopsy. That's what I've heard. I don't think we're going to need that here. And here's why. We're talking, it's not a mystery as to how Alex and Renee died, right? They were both shot to death. And so, it's pretty straightforward. What's important, what probably will be important, is how many times were they shot? Where were those injuries? We know that from seeing video, it appears Renee Good was shot multiple times. Well, which of those, were all of those injuries fatal? Were they not? What direction were they? So that's the kind of information that we need, and so I have every confidence that the ME will do a very thorough job and give us the information that we need to be able to answer those questions.
Understood. Have you been in touch with the families, and if so, what are their sentiments? Have they shared what justice looks like to them?
So both families have reached out to us. We have victim witness staff who've been assigned to them, which is what we would typically do. We sometimes we do that before there may be any charges at all, just so that they have a contact point with our office and can get the information about how do you get the body, just terrible things like that that people have to deal with. So both have asked to speak with me in terms of Renee Good. We want to make sure that all interviews, I'm always willing to meet with anybody, but we want to make sure appropriate interviews are conducted before that. And we have been in communication with them, our victim witness staff, to explain to them the process as best we can, because I can't even imagine what it would be like to suddenly be, Renee Good's widow or, Alex Pretti's parents. What I will say that's been conveyed, and I think most people have seen the statement that the family of Alex Pretti made, and this happened to Renee Good too. Suddenly, and this is the problem, as I said, within a very short period of time, there were attempts by the administration to assassinate their characters with no basis that I can see. So suddenly it started that they were both domestic terrorists and that kind of thing. And so one thing that the Pretti family has asked of us too is to try to correct that narrative. And I think it's important to differentiate. Our decision is going to be, is there proof to charge or not? That is actually kind of a separate issue from who Alex and Renee were. And so to say neither one of them were domestic terrorists, and from Alex's family, he was an ICU nurse at the Veterans, a very kind, loving person. And so I think that's the way the family wants him remembered, and I think that people should honor that and try to keep in context why the administration is saying these things about them in both cases, and really try to focus on who they were.
In the context of why they were out in
Yes.
community
Yes.
doing what they're doing,
Yes.
there's
Completely.
been consistent constitutional violations, due process violations. These things are playing out in court now, and
Yes.
From our vantage point, it's almost as though mainstream media nationally is portraying these things as though they're just happening in a vacuum, as if community members here are not aware of the constitutional violations that continue to occur.
And that is something I've talked about.
Yeah.
I'm always making it clear our office's role is what it is, right? And I've talked to local law enforcement about this too, who said, well, I don't want to be political. And it's like, whatever you think about ICE's presence here, they are, federal agents are engaging in behavior that is violating people's constitutional rights. And one of the things I've said to them too is, I've also heard, well, we want to remain neutral. And I said, it is not neutral to be there. And if you see a federal agent engaging in unlawful use of force, it is not being neutral to stand there and watch that. You do have jurisdiction to investigate, just as you normally would. Yes, there are barriers. They're wearing masks. They may not tell you who they are, or unless you arrest them. But that's something. That's an issue that I think still has to be faced here. It is, what is local law enforcement willing to do here? Because we have tried to empower them to say, you have jurisdiction to investigate, and even if you don't entirely know what this is, send it to us. We'll help you with it. We'll determine, maybe it is a policy violation, it's not a criminal offense, but we'll help you with that. And yet, to this date, we haven't received a single case from anyone in local law enforcement. It is very hard for people nationally to understand what Minnesotans are doing. One thing I have also talked about consistently is especially people in Minneapolis, Hennepin County, know how to protest in nonviolent ways, and people are, by and large, like a vast majority, peaceful. Sometimes people do things that might violate the law, but they're investigated, and those cases might be submitted to us or the city attorney's office. So we know how to do protest here in nonviolent ways. The chaos that's here is being caused by ICE. But I do get the impression that nationally, I hear this all the time, I hear from people nationally, they are seeing the videos, and I think the fact that the people here are willing to bear witness to what's happening and put out videos of it has been incredibly powerful. After Bovino left, and you've got a woman who is sobbing and holding a small child, a very cute child who's holding an ice cream cone as the federal government hauls away one of their relatives, but also the Hmong elder. And I have explained multiple times that the Hmong are here. I think we have the second largest Hmong population in the country, and they are only here because they helped the United States in the war in Laos. They would prefer to be back in Laos, but they're here because they helped us and they were persecuted there. And so you've got this elderly man who is dragged out of his house wearing his boxers and Crocs, and it was only his family that managed to drape kind of a blanket over his shoulders.
That was my old neighbor.
Oh, yeah. And he's a citizen.
Yeah.
And they thought he was somebody who is actually in our prison system, and they had been told by our Department of Corrections that he was in our prison system. And, that, I think, is just so counter to the narrative that people across the country have heard about. This is about, and I hate this phrase, the worst of the word, I don't even know what that means, but public safety. This is not about public safety, it's about retaliation by this administration against Minnesotans.
And retaliation for what?
Well, I think we can maybe take the president's own words. He seems to believe that he won this state. He did not 3 times.
And that's why he's asking for the voter rolls.
Yes, and I see that, and what I heard from Homan had a press conference this morning, and he was very clear that they will withdraw if they get cooperation from Minnesota. It's important for people to understand that Minnesota, Minneapolis, everybody is handing over the information that they are required to hand over by law. By law. That information is and has been given to Homeland Security for years. So what they are asking for is information that is not required by law. It's also important that people know that Homeland Security, what they are doing is civil enforcement. It is not criminal enforcement. It is not, a crime to be here without documentation. And so no one is required, no law enforcement, no city is required to help them do civil enforcement. That's what the separation ordinance is about. And in fact, if you listen to local law enforcement, they will tell you that it is not in the interest of public safety for them to help ICE in ways that they don't have to, because then their community members will not come forward when they are the victims of crime. And often immigrants are victims of crime because people prey upon them because they hope that they don't call the police. So you can hear police over and over saying it's really not in our interest to have people who are afraid to share information with us. So I think Homan made it very clear that they will withdraw, but only if Minnesota gives them information that Minnesota is not required to give them. And so that, I certainly hope that we stick to our Minnesota values. But I don't know. I guess it remains to be seen what that looks like.
As we wrap, is there any brief final remarks you'd like to leave people with?
I think the context is important. I think the context that Minnesota has always complied with what's required of them by law, that this is not about that, that by the federal government's own data that they took down, American-born citizens are much more likely to commit crime than immigrants are. We have had no crime surge. In fact, crime has gone down substantially before all of this happened across the country. And Minnesota was under assault, I would say legally, far before this happened. I had a press conference, and this wasn't about Minnesota, about the Lake and Riley Act. And I was surrounded by our domestic violence advocates talking about how the Lake and Riley Act was going to make it less likely that domestic violence victims and other victims of crimes would seek help. But that got passed. And then, as people probably know, we learned on Twitter, I guess I'll always call it Twitter, that our office was being investigated by the Department of Justice, remarkably for violating pattern and practice of discrimination. But it was because we had asked our lawyers to consider the role that race was playing and disparities on decision-making points. The fascinating thing about that is that the federal government does not like, this federal government does not like consent decrees. In fact, they pulled out of the consent decree with Minneapolis Police Department, and they're doing a pattern and practice investigation on a policy that we had just implemented. And then we know that Hennepin County and the rest of the state was also under attack for DEI, and they were trying to take grants and money back, and we know about that. So all of that was happening before this started. So I think that context is important in the lead up to this.
Absolutely.